Hi, I'm Serena Halstead.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith.
And I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to Data Lit. And we're in the middle of our Working with Data series. So far, we've covered Do You Have What It Takes to Be Data Lit, where we looked at some of the skills behind this, and exploring multiple measures in your data story, looking at different data types. And we actually got some feedback from a Wake County staff member I wanted to kind of share with y'all before we start. Yeah.
We got fans?
Apparently, we got one. Let's see if we can double it after this episode.
Okay, tell me what you said.
Yeah, so Title I Program Specialist Martina Lowry wrote into us saying, I absolutely love your podcast. That's very kind of you to say. Thank you. As a program specialist for Title I, I'm always using data to inform our teachers of assessment results, such as EOGs, BOY, MOI, and EOY data to enable them to have a clear view of data for the schools they're supporting. It's wonderful to hear all the information you're providing around being data literate and how it relates to others. Thank you. And thank you, Martina.
Yeah,
Thank you.
nice.
Yeah, and if y'all have any messages or questions or comments, you can always get the contact form on our website, www.wcpss.net/datalit. And Martina, you ended your message with saying, how to relate it to others, because that's, I think, the tricky part, right? Like, you can know the data, but then how you communicate that and how you communicate that in a way that's going to accomplish your goals, that's where it gets challenging. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today in this episode. Yeah, how to talk about data. And we're using for the base of this episode a fantastic article that we'll drop in the show notes, 5 Good Ways to Talk About Data from Educational Leadership. It was written by Amanda Datnow and Vicky Park. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through those 5 tips and kind of dissect them and talk about what this might look like in a PLT in a school. And Mellisa, I believe you have the first one. What's the first tip?
So one of the most profound statements I read in this article is from a principal who said, quote, "Without collaboration and collegiality, data use is impossible," end of quote. So for me, that means that teachers need time and culture to be front and center. And so the first point that they start with is students are the shared responsibility of everyone. And to me, that feels very intentional that they start there, only because you know how you always hear that your students can't learn from you unless they feel a relationship with you? Mm-hmm. I feel the same thing as with teachers, right? We can't learn from each other unless we feel that we are sort of in a relationship with each other. Yeah. And so it feels intentional that they start there with students are the shared responsibility of everyone. And for me, that the message was, when I'm a middle school teacher, I have my class of students, who are in my homeroom or in all of my classes, but they don't just belong to me. Their well-being and their ability to do well is the responsibility of my entire team. And I thought that was a really good message.
And so for me, when I saw this, students are the shared responsibility, I'm just thinking, even coming in as a new teacher, I don't know the student per se, but I know I have this class to teach the core subjects. I think about, how do I get to know these students and to be the sharing in the responsibility? And so as a new teacher, it will require me maybe to step into the PE class for a little to observe the student behavior. Yeah. I'll also go to art. I'll go to recess and kick some ball, throw some hoops at them. I'm trying to get to know them. And so in the article where it says 5 good ways to talk about data, it mentioned that there was this holistic idea of getting to know the students. And for you to get to know them, why not go into the different subjects that, just see how they interact with the teacher. You might learn something in PE that you didn't know that this child is good at, something in art. You can take some strategies from where you see in different subject areas, take it back to your core subject, whether it be English language arts or mathematics. Take back that art principle that you learned observing them in art. Come back to your class, maybe do something around art, poetry, combine it, but that holistic approach, definitely that's how you be getting to that shared responsibility of students.
I like that example.
Yeah, I love it. I think students will sometimes show aspects of their personality and abilities in some of those electives and special classes that you might not see if you're only speaking within your PLCs. Because the PLC conversation, I think that's that almost like concentric circles. Like that's the first circle that our whole PLC owns this. But then jumping out a layer to those other teachers that the kids are going to go to, I think that's huge. And then probably most importantly, just involving the families themselves. Too often, I think we talk at families instead of with them, but giving them a space at that table, an open invitation to share, I think is important. And there was a great article that we'll put in the show notes, how to share data with families. I think we've mentioned a few times throughout the series. Yeah, and I think that gives some nice kind of practical, tangible tips for how to do so.
I think the other thing that this point reminded me of is, when they say it takes a village to raise a child, it reminds me that, again, every child, regardless of whether you're their lead teacher or not, every child in our school is equally our responsibility, right? And so when you think of leadership that helps to cultivate that culture where they're not just the classroom teacher's responsibility, they're the nurse's responsibility, they're their custodian's responsibility. Every child is all of us, and it takes all of us to kind of, make sure that they're successful.
And I'm going to take something here back from the article, and this is a quote here. It says, teachers make it their business, as it said, it takes a village to raise the student, but it says teachers make it their business to know one another's student and their family. And I'm thinking about, yes, I teach maybe 5th grade. There's a other 5th grade teacher, but sometimes we tend to be, just close your door. These are the group of students you were assigned. Focus on those students. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, when, it's time for the big assessments, they're looking at the entire 5th grade. How did the 5th grade perform? And later on, we might talk about how did Miss Halstead's class did versus, Miss Smith. But at the end of the day, we feel good on the team knowing that the entire 5th grade performed well on whatever task they were assigned. So that's shared responsibility. Don't just get to know the student in the other teacher's class. Also get to know the parent. A parent might just simply tell you something important about their child that they didn't get a chance to tell the other teacher, right? Or maybe they feel more comfortable with you because they have known you before. Maybe this new teacher is in 5th grade, but they knew you before, so they come and tell you something about the child. So get to work alongside the teacher, know the students in that teacher's class as well as the parents.
I like that. That's good. I think it's important for both students and families to have relationships with staff in the building that aren't the ones that are being graded. So if the student has the chance to connect with other teachers, that they don't feel like there is that, power imbalance, then that might allow them to connect. And then that teacher's input or that staff member, that person, I think that might be really helpful when you're trying to think of what the data is suggesting. So now when you're having those conversations about the data, I think that there's another point here that's really key that Serena, I believe you're going to talk about next.
All right. So the next point, the second point here, it says conversations about data include healthy disagreement. And when I looked at that, I'm like, should we be having any disagreement about what the data says? Yes, it is possible. Mm-hmm. I go back again to thinking about a novice teacher. She might look at that data and see, okay, all my students failed this assessment. So let's say that we're giving a common assessment right across the grade level. All the students in my class failed. She's new. And that's all the thing she sees. I need to reteach this. While the other teacher said to herself, well, this ain't nothing new. They're always doing poorly on the test. But she's seeing something different. And so do we reteach? So conversations start to come up. Are we going to disagree? Are we going to agree to reteach? Are we going to move on? So some disagreement might come in, but whatever the disagreement, what I like about what the article says is that regardless of the disagreement, it must be productive. Yeah. It must move the student forward. And so that idea, yes, we're going to disagree, but at the end of the day, it should be quality product we're going to be producing for the good of the students. Mellisa, your thoughts on that?
So for this one, what struck out to me when I read about healthy disagreement, I think what supports creating a culture where you can have that is from the adaptive schools, where they talk about the 7 norms of collaboration. And those 7 norms, the first one is pausing, then paraphrasing, then posing questions, then putting ideas on the table. 5th one, providing data, which is the core of it, paying attention to self and others, and then presuming positive intentions. I think those 7 norms are ones that we can all gravitate to. And if we keep those in our minds, it sort of helps foster that whole idea of it's okay to disagree.
Yeah.
And how can we disagree and still get work done? I think a lot of folks feel as though disagreement is a bad thing and then they get stuck, but we can disagree. And you don't want to do a sort of agree to disagree, that kind of has a sort of
right. It's not going anywhere.
Passive aggressive.
Right. Okay, I'm going to agree to disagree, but a way that we can disagree and still disagree and get the work done. And I think having those 7 norms, or just norms of itself, norms where we have something to refer to when we're collaborating is good to have.
I like that you mentioned that norms, Mellisa, and it also mentioned too that the disagreement should be resolved respectfully.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is great too, because one thing, students notice a lot more than we realize. And if students see us using these norms and coming up with a healthy way to manage disagreement, then they're going to learn from that. The kids pay more attention to what we do than what we say. Right. So I think that's really helpful. And I like how the article pointed out that healthy disagreement is a feature, not a flaw. And there's that line, if you don't disagree, then there's something wrong because you got 10 different personalities on the team, Because I think this can help, and we talked about this in the previous episodes, kind of get past some bias. I was reading Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and he talks about, a quote, contrary to the rule of philosophers of science who advise testing hypotheses by trying to refute them, people, and scientists quite often, seek data that are likely to be compatible with the beliefs that they currently hold. So really just building into your PLC time, chance to, okay, does anybody have a contrasting opinion? Because otherwise my brain is just going to skip over the parts that kind of contradict my pre-existing hypothesis. So really embracing this this healthy disagreement, I think, is going to be really beneficial when we're talking about data.
So he's talking about this sort of ability to stop and ask for ideas or opinions that refute what's on the table, then a space to allow that to happen. Is that what?
Yeah, and I'm thinking that might be part of the conversations when you're talking about data. Don't just accept disagreement, but ask for it. Say, am I looking at this wrong? Does anybody have any different interpretations? Right. Because data is, I think sometimes it provides the illusion that everything is 100% certain just because, 34 out of 50 is 68%, therefore 68%. But there might be some stuff in the data that we're not realizing. So really embracing the disagreement, I think, is a useful piece of advice.
So Spencer, what about the third one?
Yeah, the third point here was that conversations about data engender trust rather than suspicion. I think we've kind of started to talk about this with the last part, and that's tied to that disagreement. And it got me thinking about how this can either be a vicious or virtuous cycle based on how you've dealt with the disagreement in the past. Correct. And that there's an infographic from Educational Leadership, 8 data points to ponder, that talks about data can make the push for change less personal. The issue isn't about you or me, it's about the goal we're trying to achieve. So when done right, when you've built those relationships, and that seems to be this underlying theme behind this entire podcast, it's about those relationships, that I think data can engender trust. But if you haven't communicated properly, if you have not built those relationships properly, then sometimes data can feel like it's a piece, like a threat, not a bridge to kind of better connection. So what were y'all's thoughts on this point about engendering trust rather than suspicion?
So conversations about data engender trust rather than suspicion. And I'm thinking, where does this trust start? It starts with teachers having respect. It starts with leaders building norms or some protocols that ensure that, everybody has a voice at the table. No matter if the person is new, everybody's voice should be heard at the table, right? And how you get their voice to be heard is genuinely listen to what they're saying. And having that protocol, when you're following some protocol, not to say, I'm checking off this, checking off that, but making sure that if this is one of the things on the list of things to do, make sure everybody has a say-so in it and not just, okay, this person has been here, the veteran 10, 20 years in teaching, they always get the scores, they know how. The novice needs to feel like they're a part of that conversation too, right? And learn something from them. Like we'd say, Everybody has their story, right? But we're going to use the data to guide the story. And if you feel like a teacher at the table is novice to all of that, still encourage them to hear what they have to say. Because by them speaking, you might hear some flaw, but then you can correct it. But if you don't allow them to speak, they're going to leave that data team meeting with misinterpretations. So let them speak at the table so that everybody can come to some shared understanding as to what we're going to do with the data next.
I like that. And I think that one of those norms that I mentioned that is really helpful in building that spirit of trust is assuming positive intentions. And the other good piece of advice that I once heard is when you are trying to build relationships and build that trust between teachers, don't wait for data. Like your data conversation shouldn't be the first time you're doing that. Like it's about being intentional about building that relationship and building that climate of trust outside of data conversations.
Yep.
Like so when they're planning or when they're just getting to know each other. A lot of times I know I've been in situations where, we've started a new school year, I have new people on my team and we just start running, right? And we weren't intentional about learning about each other and building a collegial relationship with each other so that when we get to like the hard stuff, like talking about our data and being vulnerable with each other, we have something to fall back on. If you wait until the data conversation to be the one where we're now trying to build trust and talk about data at the same time, I think it's really difficult. So I think you kind of have to have that first, and then it kind of helps or supports the ability to then talk about data because it's so personal.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about relationships, person to person, but I think also the relationship of the people and the data. The article said that some teachers mistrust data use because they fear that the data may be used against them. Mm-hmm. If people's relationship to data is only with summative data, going back to our series from last season, and that data is only used for labeling the self level, going back to that research we've talked about from Hattie.
Yes.
Then they're it's not going to engender trust. So don't only talk about data when it's summative data. Be looking at that interim data. Be looking at that formative data. Have relationships with data that aren't so high stakes. I think that's going to help. And there's an article, Mindsets Are the Key to Effective Data Use. And they touched on this, saying there were some studies saying that high-pressure environments, whether in school or business, make it hard for people to own up to their shortcomings and work together. That's exactly what a study of high-stakes accountability in an urban district found. The longer low-performing schools faced the threat of sanctions, the less apt they were to examine their underlying assumptions and current practices and pull together to improve them. So if data is only used as a weapon, that's going to be problematic. Mm-hmm. Data should start conversations, not end them. I think that's important for engendering trust. Okay, and then Mellisa, what's the next one?
So the next component they talked about in this article was data teams take a solution-oriented approach. And so they talked about, looking at solutions, but not jumping to solutions, right? And so I think the best way to do that is to kind of have an approach. And so I know within our district, we use what's called the team-initiated problem-solving model, or otherwise known as the TIPS model. And it starts with first identifying the problem, developing a hypothesis, discussing and selecting solutions, developing and implementing an action plan, evaluating that action plan. And all of that is done around data, collecting and using data as the focus. And again, having a process, having a protocol is really helpful in having a solution-oriented approach. I think solution-oriented approach, when I hear that, is all about a growth mindset as well, right? It's what mindset do you need to take on in order to keep the work moving? What do you all think about that?
I like that you reminded us, Mellisa, about the TIPS model. And going back to that solution approach as well, also teachers being reflective to think about what their instructional practices are, how are their students doing while they were teaching. I remember when I started teaching, I had to do a reflection on all my lessons. Now, that was a killer. It was after writing such a long, lengthy lesson plan, then I have to come back now and reflect. Now, I recall my principal. He was not so much interested in what my lesson plan was. He was interested in the reflection. And I had to say, how many students did this? How did the students feel that? And then how do you plan to more or less differentiate for those students that didn't get it. But that was just a big thing for me where I hated it. I hated going back to write all of this lengthy notes. But he basically wanted to see, are you thinking forward?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
The lesson doesn't stop there because remember, learning, it builds on the next level, right? So he wanted to see, are you thinking about what you do today? Will it connect with what you're planning on teaching later on or tomorrow? And so I remember coming here, so I started teaching in the America. I didn't have to do that section. It was like, thank you, thank you, thank you. There's no reflection piece for me to write. But then, even though I didn't have to write it, it was so ingrained in my mind that I'm always, it's good practice. A teacher's supposed to be able to walk into your room and say, your students did well on this. What did you do? Can you replicate what you did yesterday with this class today? So that reflection piece, like it says, data teams take a solution-oriented approach. That approach also involves you being reflective about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to just be cognizant of what the solution is that you're focusing on, what the data is being used for. I think too often data use and conversations about data then fall into the category of just compliance. You just do it because you're supposed to, or for labeling, just to figure out which category we can put each kid about. But when, like what you're speaking at, data is used to impact and modify instruction, then that's where it can be a more practical and useful solution.
I think it's also important too for this point when you think of solution oriented, right? As a teacher, we all know that I can only control my practices as an adult. I can't control what the students do. And so to think of solutions as solutions where I have the high impact solutions are things that I can control. And so when you're looking at data, how do you move from, because it's natural for us to start with a learner-centered problem and move that into a problem of practice. Because again, a problem of practice means me. That's all back on me. It's something that I, as the teacher, have to do differently. And so again, if you think of solution-oriented, for me, again, is coming back to what do I have to do differently? How do I have to act differently? Try something differently to, again, keep this whole process of continuous improvement moving.
And I think that kind of brings us to the last point about what you're focusing on. Serena, you want to tell us about that?
All right. So for the last component, data teams, they know what they're expected to accomplish. I like how you laughed about that. Walking into a meeting and like, here we go again. And that here we go again tells me that they don't know what they're expected to do. So data teams know what they're expected to do. And I'm just going to read that first line of the article. It says, leaders play a significant role in setting the expectations for teacher discussion about data. And so, yes, teachers are going to be meeting and talking, but the leaders, the principals, they're responsible so that at the beginning of the school year, we're going to meet in small group to talk about what the 5th grade team is doing, what the 1st grade team is doing. The principals need to be sitting in and setting some expectations that this is what we're trying to accomplish. And there are some expectations that whenever we end the conversation for the day, we're all having some knowledge about how we're going to move forward. So I like that. The teams should know what they're expected to do. So Spencer, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right to identify that this is a spot where strong leadership can really help steer that ship. In the article, Mindsets Are Key to Effective Data Use, they give a case study of a team of teachers, and they say they quickly work through a data discussion protocol without reflecting or identifying any changes in instruction before exclaiming, yay, we're done. And that is the idea of just, if what they're expected to do is just finish the protocol, just work through, then it's not going to be used to reflect on instruction, curriculum, environment. So that's where they stress instead a principal who clearly defines the purpose for data analysis and creates a we feeling for the school. I think when you do that, that can make it clear to PLCs, to that shared responsibility of everyone of what they're doing and why they're doing it.
And again, what is expected at the end of that meeting, right? Because I feel as though in a lot of schools, we have time that's carved out for looking at our data. But like you said, we get together, we talk about the data, and then that's it. We've done it. And really understanding what is the expectation. Are we supposed to leave this meeting with an instructional plan? Are we supposed to meet this meeting with new strategies? Are we supposed to leave this meeting with a list of names that we need to work with? What do we need to be doing at the end of this meeting? Not just meeting, but what are the next steps for the end of this meeting? I think those need to be really clear.
I like this quote, and this is coming from Edward Denning. And he said, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. That, it just stood out to me. So we come to our team meetings and we know we're going to talk about the students' performance in different subject area. But you come and you're talking, oh, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. Where is the data to support that they didn't do? Right? So we don't want to come to our meetings without an expectation. And that expectation is that when we sit at this table, we're going to use data to make our decisions. Going back again, without data, you're just another person with an opinion.
I like that. Okay, so we've looked at 5 points for guidance for how to talk about data. So Serena and Mellisa, which ones are each of you going to focus on moving forward? What do you think, Mellisa?
That's a good one, Spencer. So I think for me, it is the first one, not because it was the first one that I covered.
The shared responsibility?
The shared responsibility. Data is the shared responsibility. Because again, I think this whole we-ness, it takes a village like that. That's a core of one of my philosophies when I'm in the classroom, right? Or even when I'm working here, it takes a village. So if I do a more we-centered approach, not just in my day-to-day work, inside the classroom or outside of the classroom, I think that goes a long way in how we get work done.
Thank you. Serena?
And for me, I'm taking the third one. It says conversations about data engender trust rather than suspicion. And going back to what Mellisa is saying about that shared responsibility, if we're all agreeing that the students and their achievement is our responsibility, we should take that, oh, well, this class didn't do well and my class do better and I'm going to hide my score. And no. If students are our shared responsibility, we come to that table knowing that, yes, this class did not perform as we expected, but because they're our shared responsibility, we're going to let it go. It's not about my class. It's about the entire picture of our school. And so we're going to have that conversation that focuses on how do we move our student forward based on this data that we're seeing and not blame anybody for, oh, you didn't do as well. Right? So building that trust, and the trust starts with us accepting that every student in the building is our shared responsibility.
I like that. Yeah, and for me, I want to focus on that solution-oriented approach. I think it's probably easy for me working in central office to just drop data on people without giving them that guidance of just
you've been dropping data bombs.
I hope not, but I think it's easy for me to do so because I'm not in those buildings. So instead, if I can kind of help people figure out what the solutions are and the steps to get there, I think that might be more beneficial for them. And that's something that we're actually going to focus on in our next episode, which is looking at what are some of the obstacles that prevent teachers from engaging with data and how we might overcome them, coming up with some solutions for those. So that's what we'll dive into next time. If you want to contact us, give us any thoughts for future episodes, ask any questions like the one we addressed at the beginning of the episode, you can do so at www.wcpss.net/datalit. And big thanks to Cary High School's Logan Foster for providing us with the music for this series, and also to Digital Learning Coordinator Chris Zirkle for the production assistance. Thank you, listeners. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.